Most people think intelligence is about knowing the most information, but information alone rarely makes someone the smartest person in the room. In many situations, the person with the most influence is not the one speaking the most. It is the one who understands the situation the fastest, the one who has already mapped the conversation before anyone else has finished their first sentence. The one who, when they finally speak, says something that makes everyone else pause, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precisely true. Have you ever noticed how some people barely speak in a conversation, yet when they finally do, everyone listens? It is not accidental, and it is not a personality trait that some people are born with and others are not. It is a way of operating. It is a set of cognitive habits that can be developed, refined, and applied consistently. Real intelligence is not loud. It is not aggressive. It is not performed. It is structured. It is calm. It observes first, then speaks with precision. The loudest person in the room is usually fighting to be heard. The sharpest person in the room usually does not need to fight at all. There is a fundamental difference between those two states, not just in behavior, but in the underlying thinking that produces that behavior. What you will encounter in this training is not a collection of tricks or tactics. It is a way of understanding how clear thinking actually works, how composed people think differently in conversations, decisions, and high-pressure environments, how they listen differently, how they process what they hear differently, and how, when they finally speak, they do it in a way that carries more weight than most people ever manage with far more words. This is not about becoming someone cold or calculating. It is not about suppressing your natural voice or pretending to be detached. It is about developing a precision in your thinking that most people never bother to build, because most people assume they are already thinking well, when in reality, they are simply reacting quickly. There is a significant difference between thinking and reacting, and once you understand that difference, once you genuinely feel it, your relationship to conversations, arguments, decisions, and social environments will shift in ways that are difficult to reverse. So consider this carefully. Most people, when they walk into a conversation or a room full of people, are already in a reactive state. They are scanning for opportunities to speak. They are forming responses before the other person has finished their sentence. They are mentally rehearsing what they want to say while someone else is still talking. They believe this is engagement. In many cases, it is the opposite. What they are actually doing is filtering every incoming piece of information through the lens of their existing opinion. They are not listening. They are waiting, and while they wait, they miss details that a more composed observer would catch without effort. This is not a flaw in those people specifically. It is a deeply embedded pattern that most people develop without realizing it. A pattern where the priority is to contribute rather than to understand. And when contributing becomes the goal, understanding tends to suffer. The sharpest thinkers in any environment have, often without formal instruction, reversed this pattern. Their first priority is understanding. Their second priority, far down the line, is contribution. And because of that reversal, when they do contribute, what they say tends to be more accurate, more relevant, and more useful than what was said by people who prioritized speaking. This does not mean they are passive. It does not mean they withhold their views or avoid engagement. It means they have developed the discipline to ensure that what they say reflects actual understanding rather than just the desire to participate. And that discipline begins long before anyone opens their mouth. It begins with observation. When you walk into a room, any conversation, any meeting, any gathering, there is a window of time, often only a few minutes, where the most valuable information in that environment is freely available. The way people are positioned, the way they are interacting, who defers to whom, who is performing and who is comfortable, who is watching and who is being watched, the pace and tone of conversations already underway, the unspoken agreements about who is expected to speak and who is expected to listen. Most people enter a room and immediately focus on their own status within it. They ask themselves, consciously or not, how they are being perceived. They adjust their posture, their expression, their behavior to manage that perception. They are, from the first moment, directing their attention inward. The sharper observer does the opposite. Their attention, from the first moment, is directed outward, not because they are indifferent to how they are perceived. Everyone has some interest in that, but because they understand that the information available in those first few minutes of a room or a conversation is genuinely valuable, and it is only available once. You cannot go back and observe the beginning of a conversation after it has already moved forward. You cannot recapture the initial dynamic of a room. Once you have spent those early minutes in self, monitoring rather than outward observation. But if you spend those early minutes observing carefully, you will know things that no one else in that room has bothered to notice. You will know who the actual decision makers are, as opposed to the people who merely hold titles. You will know where the tensions are. You will know who is aligned and who is not. You will know where the conversation is likely to go, and what the real questions are beneath the surface. Level discussion. This kind of early observation is not a strategy for gaining power over others. It is simply a commitment to accuracy, a refusal to operate on assumptions when evidence is available. And there is always evidence. In every room, in every conversation, people are constantly producing information about themselves. Through their words, their silences, their reactions, their posture, their tone, the way they respond when something unexpected is said. Most people do not register this information because they are too focused on producing information themselves. The observer registers it, and that registration creates a kind of clarity that talking cannot produce. This is why people who talk the most in a given environment are often the ones who understand it the least, not because talking is inherently unintelligent. Far from it, but because the act of talking, while you are doing it, significantly reduces the amount of information you can absorb from the surrounding environment. You cannot speak and listen simultaneously at the depth that either activity requires. You can do both shallowly. Most people do. They speak while half listening. They listen while half formulating their next point. The result is a conversation where no one is fully present, where everyone is performing engagement while only partially experiencing it. The person who chooses to be fully present in a conversation, even at the cost of speaking less, gains something that the active performers do not. They gain a complete picture, and a complete picture is almost always more valuable than a fast reaction. This connects to something important about how most people misunderstand intelligence. Intelligence, in the common imagination, is often associated with speed, the quick thinker, the sharp retort, the person who has an answer before you have finished your question. This version of intelligence is real. Quick processing is a genuine cognitive advantage in certain contexts, but it is far from the whole picture, and in many situations, it is actually a liability. Speed in thinking, without depth in thinking, produces responses that are fast but shallow. They sound confident, they feel fluent, but they skip steps that slower, more careful thinking would not have skipped. They build on assumptions that have not been examined. They solve the surface problem while leaving the real problem untouched. Deep thinking is not slow thinking. It is complete thinking. It does not mean sitting in silence for 10 minutes before responding to a simple question. It means ensuring that before you speak, you have asked yourself the questions that need to be asked. Not all of them. Perfection in understanding is never available, but enough of them that your contribution reflects genuine comprehension rather than quick reaction. The difference between a fast, shallow response and a precise, accurate one is almost always detectable. People may not be able to articulate why one feels more intelligent than the other, but they feel it. They feel the difference between someone who spoke to fill space and someone who spoke because they had something accurate to add. Over time, that distinction defines how people are perceived. Not in a single conversation, but across the accumulated experience of interacting with someone. The person who consistently offers precise, accurate contributions builds a kind of credibility that the fast talker rarely achieves. Because credibility is built through accuracy, and accuracy requires more than speed. It requires the willingness to pause. The willingness to think before committing to a position. The willingness to say nothing when nothing accurate is available to be said. That last willingness is, for many people, the most difficult to develop. Most social environments carry an implicit pressure to speak. Silence in a conversation feels to many people like a vacancy, something that needs to be filled before someone else fills it with something you did not agree with. There is an anxiety in conversational silence that drives people to speak before they are ready, to offer half-formed thoughts simply to occupy the space. This anxiety is understandable. Silence can feel like absence, like you are not participating, like others might conclude you have nothing to offer. But consider what actually happens when someone speaks with precision after a thoughtful pause. Consider the difference between someone who responds to a complex question immediately with a long, fast answer, and someone who pauses, considers, and then offers something shorter, clearer, and more accurate. Which one do you remember? Which one feels more credible? The person who speaks with precision after a pause is not performing wisdom. They are demonstrating something real. That they think before they speak. That their words are the product of thought, not the absence of it. And that distinction is registered, whether consciously or not, by everyone in the conversation. Strategic silence is not theatrical. It is not a technique for seeming thoughtful while actually being empty. It is the natural product of genuine thinking, when you actually engage with what was said before responding, when you genuinely process it rather than simply reacting to it. A brief pause is the natural result. It is not engineered. It is what thinking actually looks like from the outside. The person who develops a habit of actual thinking, as opposed to fast reacting, will naturally develop something that looks like composure. And composure, in most social and professional environments, is perceived as intelligence. Not because of how it looks, but because of what it produces. Composure produces clear speech. Clear speech produces understanding. Understanding produces solutions, insights, or accurate assessments where others were only producing noise. There is another dimension to this that most people overlook entirely, and it has to do with what people do with what they observe before they speak. Observation, by itself, is only half the process. The other half is pattern recognition. The human mind is naturally oriented toward pattern detection. It is how we make sense of the world, by identifying repetitions, consisections, and underlying structures. But most people apply this capacity only loosely to obvious patterns. They notice when someone is consistently late. They notice when a conversation always ends in argument. They notice surface-level repetitions. The sharper thinker applies pattern recognition more deliberately and at a greater depth. They notice not just what is being said, but the underlying structure of how someone argues. They notice not just what someone does, but what category of behavior that falls into, and whether that category is consistent with other behaviors they have observed in the same person. They notice when a conversation has shifted from its stated subject to something else entirely, when the ostensible topic is just the arena, and the real negotiation is about something that has not been named. In many conversations, especially in professional or social environments with high stakes, what people say and what they mean are significantly different things. This is not deception. Most of the time, the people involved are not consciously aware of the gap. They are talking about budget allocations, but the real conversation is about territory and control. They are talking about project timelines, but the real conversation is about trust. They are talking about a policy, but the real conversation is about whose judgment is being respected. The person who can identify the real conversation, the one beneath the stated one, operates at an enormous advantage. Not because they can exploit that knowledge, but because they can actually address what matters. They can speak to what people actually care about, rather than to the surface topic that is covering it. This requires practice. It requires developing a habit of asking, in any given conversation, what is actually at stake here. Not what the stated subject is, but what the real issue is. What the people involved actually want. What they are actually worried about. What outcome they would consider a win, even if they have not said so explicitly. Those questions do not always have clear answers. Sometimes the real issue is genuinely murky, even to the people involved. But the act of asking them, the habit of looking beneath the surface, produces a quality of attention that transforms how you engage. It means you stop responding to the surface of what was said and start responding to what actually matters. And when you do that consistently, people experience you differently. They may not know why. They may simply feel that you understand things quickly, that your response is cut to the heart of the matter, that talking to you is more useful than talking to others. What they are actually experiencing is the product of a different kind of attention, not smarter attention in some genetic or fixed sense, but more directed attention. Attention that has been trained to look past the immediate and toward the structural. This kind of attention also changes how you handle disagreement. Most disagreements are not actually disagreements about facts. They are disagreements about the interpretation of facts, or about which facts are relevant, or about what the facts imply for a course of action. They are almost always more complex than they appear. The instinctive response to disagreement, for most people, is to defend the position they have already taken. Once they have said something, they have a psychological investment in it. Changing their position feels like a concession or a loss of face. So they defend, often regardless of the actual quality of the argument against them. This is a deeply understandable pattern. Nobody enjoys being wrong. Nobody enjoys the discomfort of revising what they believed a moment ago. But the problem with this pattern is obvious. If you defend your position, regardless of the quality of the opposing argument, you will frequently defend wrong positions, and defending wrong positions consistently over time damages your credibility in exactly the ways that you were trying to protect it. The intelligent approach to disagreement is not the comfortable one. It requires an actual separation between your position and your identity. It requires the ability to hear an argument against your view and evaluate it honestly. Not with hostility, not with the goal of finding a hole in it, but with genuine openness to the possibility that it is right. This does not mean accepting every counterargument. It means evaluating every counterargument on its actual merits rather than on the basis of whether accepting it would be uncomfortable for you. When you operate this way, something interesting happens. People notice. They notice that you can change your mind when presented with good information, and that noticeability, that willingness to update, is perceived as a mark of intellectual security, not weakness. The person who never changes their mind is not perceived as consistent. They are perceived, ultimately, as rigid, as someone who has stopped thinking and started defending. The person who changes their mind clearly and gracefully, when the evidence warrants it, is perceived as someone still engaged with the actual question rather than with the management of their own ego. That distinction matters in long-term relationships, professional contexts, and any environment where credibility is built over time rather than claimed in a single interaction. There is something related to this that is worth examining carefully. The way emotional control functions in the context of intelligence. Emotion is not the enemy of clear thinking. This is a common misconception, and it is worth addressing directly. The idea that intelligent people are unemotional, or that emotion interferes with clear thought, is both inaccurate and unhelpful. Emotion carries genuine information. It signals what matters to you, what you value, what you perceive as threatening or promising. Emotional signals are data, and dismissing data is not intelligence. The issue is not emotion itself. The issue is unexamined emotion, specifically, the kind of emotional activation that, when left unmanaged, takes over the thinking process entirely. When someone becomes angry, offended, or threatened in a conversation, and that emotional state drives their response before their thinking has had a chance to engage, the result is rarely accurate or useful. Not because the emotion is wrong, necessarily, but because emotion moves faster than thought, and when it takes the lead, it bypasses the processing that produces clarity. The angry response comes out before the mind has had time to ask, what is actually being said? Whether the response that emotion is driving is appropriate to the situation, and what the consequences of that response will be. The person who has developed emotional control in conversation is not someone who feels less. They are someone who has built enough space between the emotional signal and the spoken response that thinking can happen in that space. That space is often very small. It might be a breath, a pause, a moment of consciously registering what you are feeling before deciding what to do with it. The physical duration of that space is less important than the habit of creating it at all. The habit of pausing between emotional activation and verbal response is one of the most consistently useful habits a person can develop, not because it makes you cold or distant, but because it ensures that what you say is chosen rather than driven, that it reflects your considered judgment rather than the first reaction that was available. In heated conversations, this capacity becomes immediately visible. The person who remains composed while others are agitated does not need to announce their composure. It speaks for itself, and composure in a heated conversation carries an authority that noise does not. It does not mean being unmoved by what is said. It means having enough control over how you respond, that your response reflects your thinking, rather than simply your activation. This does not come naturally to most people in high-stakes situations. The training required is both internal, learning to notice your own emotional states clearly enough to manage them, and behavioral, developing the habit of slowing your response when you notice activation happening. Over time, this becomes less effortful. What starts as a deliberate practice becomes a default, and the person who has made it a default can operate in environments that would destabilize others and remain functional and clear while those around them are reacting without direction. But emotional regulation is only part of what composure involves. There is also the matter of how you structure what you say when you do decide to say it. Most people, when they speak in a group or under pressure, do not structure their thoughts before they express them. They think out loud, which can feel spontaneous and engaged, but often produces speech that is circular, unclear, or hard to follow. They begin sentences without knowing how they will end. They contradict themselves mid-thought. They make a point, then immediately qualify it in a way that undermines it, then add something else that is only tangentially related, and then conclude with a summary that does not quite match what came before. This is not a sign of unintelligence. It is a sign of unstructured expression, and unstructured expression, regardless of the quality of the underlying thinking, produces a poor impression. The ability to structure your thought before expressing it, to know the shape of what you are going to say before you say it, is a learnable skill, and one that disproportionately affects how you are perceived. Structured speech sounds more intelligent, not because structured speech is always smarter, but because it is clearer. Clarity is the thing that actually communicates understanding to others. You can have excellent thinking inside your head, but if the way you express it is tangled and unclear, the excellence of the underlying thinking is invisible. Clarity is how understanding becomes visible, and clarity begins before you speak. It begins with the brief internal organization of what you want to communicate. Not a rigid outline, not an over-prepared monologue, but a basic sense of the point you are making, the evidence or reasoning behind it, and how you want to land. Even in casual conversation, even in quick exchanges, this brief internal organization is available. The habit of doing it, of taking a fraction of a second to identify what you actually want to say before you start saying it, is the difference between speech that comes across as clear and authoritative and speech that comes across as tentative and scattered. There is also the matter of concision. Long answers are not perceived as more intelligent than short ones. In fact, in most contexts, the opposite is true. When someone gives a long answer to a question that could be answered briefly, the listener usually experiences it as a lack of confidence, as if the speaker does not trust their own answer, enough to let it stand alone, and so pads it with additional material to shore it up. The long answer says, "I am not sure this is right, so I am adding more." The short, precise answer says, "I am confident enough in this to let it stand on its own." Confidence in your own thinking is communicated more effectively through concision than through volume. This does not mean being abrupt or dismissive. It means learning to identify the core of what you want to say, and saying that without the additional material that most people add out of insecurity or habit. This requires practice. It requires listening to yourself as you speak, a form of self-monitoring that most people find difficult because they are too focused on the content of what they are saying to pay attention to how they are saying it. But the development of this dual awareness of what you are saying and how you are saying it simultaneously, is one of the defining features of someone who speaks well under pressure. They are not just thinking about their content. They are monitoring their delivery in real time, noticing when they are going in circles, noticing when they have made the point and should stop, noticing when they have added a qualifier that undermines the confidence of what they said, and adjusting. This real-time adjustment produces speech that feels efficient and authoritative, not because it is performed as such, but because the underlying monitoring is keeping it on track. There is something else that shapes how intelligence is perceived, and it is perhaps less obvious than the factors already discussed. It is the quality of the questions you ask. Most people, in conversations, ask questions primarily to obtain information they need. This is a legitimate function of questions, and it is not to be dismissed, but questions serve another function that most people underutilize. They demonstrate the quality of your thinking. A precise question tells the person being asked something about the questioner. It tells them that the questioner has already thought through enough of the issue to identify the specific gap in their understanding that needs to be filled. It tells them that the questioner is not asking out of general confusion, but out of specific, targeted curiosity. This kind of question is perceived as more intelligent than either a vague question or no question at all, because it reveals the internal structure of the questioner's thinking. It shows what they have already processed and where the boundary of their current understanding is. Vague questions reveal nothing, or worse, they reveal that the questioner has not engaged deeply enough with the subject to identify what they actually do not know. The discipline of asking precise questions requires, first, thinking clearly enough about the subject to map your own understanding of it. You need to know what you know and what you do not know before you can ask a question that accurately identifies the boundary between those two things. This is harder than it sounds. Most people have a rough sense of their understanding. They know when they are confused, but they do not have a precise map of where their understanding ends. They experience confusion as a general fog rather than as a specific gap. Developing the habit of mapping your own understanding, of asking yourself, before you ask someone else, what specifically you do and do not know, produces two benefits. First, it helps you ask better questions. Second, it frequently answers those questions for you, because the act of mapping your understanding often reveals that what you thought was confusion is actually an answer you already had. There is also the matter of restraint in questions. Not every question needs to be asked. In group settings especially, the person who asks the most questions is often the person who is processing the least. who is using questions as a substitute for the internal work of understanding. The person who asks fewer but sharper questions demonstrates more processing, more discrimination between what matters and what does not, and more respect for the time of the people being asked. Restraint in questions is not passivity, it is judgment. Knowing which questions are worth the space they take up is itself a form of thinking. And it extends further than questions. It extends to all forms of participation. In any group conversation or meeting, there are contributions that advance the collective understanding and contributions that do not. The person who consistently makes contributions that advance understanding, even if those contributions are infrequent, builds a different kind of reputation than the person who contributes constantly, but without consistent quality. Frequency of contribution is a quantity. Quality of contribution is something else entirely, and in most environments, people remember quality long after they have forgotten frequency. This means that the discipline of choosing when to speak, not just what to say, but when, is as important as the discipline of thinking clearly. There are moments in a conversation when a contribution would be welcome but not necessary. When you could add something, but what you could add has already been essentially covered, or would not materially change the direction of the discussion. In those moments, the disciplined communicator stays silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have made a judgment that saying it would not add enough to justify the space. This judgment, the assessment of whether a contribution adds sufficient value to warrant the interruption of another's thought or the consumption of collective time, is a sophisticated one. It requires simultaneously tracking the content of the conversation, the direction it is moving, and the likely impact of a given contribution on that direction. People who have developed this judgment are experienced as thoughtful, economical, and respectful of the collective process. People who have not developed it, who contribute whenever they have a thought, regardless of whether it advances anything, are experienced as noise even when their individual contributions are intelligent. There is also a connection between this kind of restraint and something important about ego. Most of the excess speech in any given conversation is driven by ego, not consciously, not maliciously, but structurally. The need to be heard, the need to demonstrate knowledge, the need to shape the direction of a discussion, the need to be seen as participating. These are all ego-driven needs, and they are understandable, but they consistently produce more speech than understanding requires. The person who has developed some degree of detachment from these needs, who can allow a conversation to proceed without feeling that their identity is at stake in each exchange, is free to make choices about when to speak that are driven by the conversation's needs rather than their own. This detachment is not indifference. It is not a lack of interest in how you are perceived. It is simply a reorientation of the priority, from managing self-image in real time to genuinely serving the conversation's direction. When you genuinely stop trying to perform intelligence and start trying to actually understand and contribute accurately, something shifts in how you come across. The performance of intelligence looks different from the real thing, and most people, at some level, can tell the difference. Not always consciously, but in the accumulated impression of an interaction. The person who is performing intelligence is subtly managing perception. The person who is genuinely thinking is doing something else, and the difference is perceptible. Part of what makes it perceptible is how each type of person handles being wrong or uncertain or out of their depth. The performer, when they encounter a subject they do not know well, typically does one of two things. They bluff or they disengage. They either produce confident, sounding speech about a subject they have not mastered, hoping that confidence will substitute for accuracy, or they visibly withdraw because their ego is too invested in being seen as knowledgeable to tolerate being seen as not knowing something. Neither response builds credibility. The first eventually fails when the gaps in knowledge become apparent. The second creates a pattern of inconsistency, engaged when in comfortable territory, disengaged when not. That undermines the impression of general competence. The person who is genuinely oriented toward understanding, rather than toward the performance of intelligence, does something different when they encounter the limits of their knowledge. They acknowledge those limits clearly and specifically, not as a general confession of ignorance, which can seem like false modesty and serves little purpose, but as an accurate identification of what they do not know. This acknowledgement, when it is specific and honest, is perceived as a mark of precision. It tells the people in the conversation that this person knows what they know and knows what they do not know, which means that when they do express confidence in something, that confidence can be trusted. Admitting uncertainty is one of the fastest ways to build intellectual credibility, because it signals that your confidence is calibrated, that you do not express it where it is not warranted, that when you say you are sure about something, you are actually sure. Most people do the opposite. They express uniform confidence because they are afraid that any admission of uncertainty will undermine how they are perceived. The result is that their confidence becomes meaningless as a signal, because it is not calibrated to their actual understanding. It cannot be used to distinguish what they genuinely know from what they are merely guessing. The person who calibrates their confidence, who is clearly certain about some things and clearly uncertain about others, creates a more trustworthy and ultimately more impressive overall picture. This is not a trick. It is simply accuracy about your own knowledge state, and accuracy, consistently maintained, builds something that few things in social interaction can build: genuine trust in your judgment. There is a layer beneath all of this that it is worth addressing directly, because without it, all the other practices described here are likely to be superficial. Most people who encounter frameworks for thinking more clearly or communicating more effectively treat them as tools for impression management. They want to seem smarter, seem more composed, seem more credible. The tools become performances. This approach produces some results in the short term. A person who consciously practices pausing before responding will, initially, come across differently than they did before. But without a deeper shift, without actually developing genuine curiosity, genuine interest in understanding, genuine commitment to accuracy, the practice will feel effortful and will eventually be abandoned, or will remain a thin layer over the same reactive patterns underneath. The deeper shift is this: a genuine orientation toward understanding what is actually true, rather than what it is comfortable or convenient to believe. This orientation is not natural for most people in all situations. It is much more comfortable to stay within the territory of what you already know and believe. The prospect of discovering that you were wrong about something important is genuinely uncomfortable. The prospect of encountering an idea that fundamentally disrupts your existing framework is threatening, even if you would not describe yourself as a person who resists new ideas, but the person who can tolerate that discomfort, who can approach a new idea, an opposing view, a challenge to their existing framework with genuine openness, gains access to a kind of learning that the intellectually defended person cannot experience. And it is through this kind of learning that real cognitive development happens. Not just the accumulation of new information, but the actual restructuring of how you think. The discovery that your existing framework was incomplete, or that a category you were using does not hold up, or that a connection you had not seen before changes the meaning of things you thought you understood. This kind of learning cannot be forced. It happens when you are genuinely open to it. And being genuinely open to it requires a relationship with your own beliefs that is not defensive, that allows beliefs to be examined rather than protected. This is what intellectual humility actually means. Not a constant proclamation that you might be wrong about everything, which is its own kind of performance, but a genuine willingness, in specific conversations and contexts, to hold your existing beliefs lightly enough to examine them, to ask whether what you believe is the result of actual reasoning or of exposure and habit, to consider the possibility that the thing you are most confident about is the thing most worth questioning. People who maintain this capacity over time develop something that is genuinely rare, a mind that continues to change in response to evidence and argument, rather than one that calcified in place sometime in early adulthood and has been defending its fixed positions ever since. The changing mind is more accurate than the fixed mind because the world changes, and a mind that cannot update cannot remain accurate to a changing world. But beyond accuracy, the changing mind is more interesting. It is more generative. It produces better questions, more unexpected connections, more creative solutions to problems that other minds have categorized as unsolvable, because their existing framework could not accommodate the solution. Real intellectual development is not the accumulation of answers. It is the refinement of how you ask questions, and the refinement of how you ask questions is directly proportional to your willingness to let go of the answers you already have when they are no longer serving you. This connects to something about how the sharpest thinkers approach problems, not just in conversation, but in general. Most people approach a problem with the goal of solving it. They want an answer. They want resolution. They move toward closure as quickly as they can because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and the feeling of having solved something is satisfying. The sharper thinker is, in some respects, less in a hurry to arrive at a conclusion. Not because they are incapable of conclusions. They often arrive at excellent ones. But because they are aware that the first available answer to a complex problem is usually not the best one. The best answer typically requires sitting with the problem longer than is comfortable, examining it from multiple angles, allowing different possibilities to remain open simultaneously, and resisting the pull of the first satisfying explanation. This willingness to remain in a state of incomplete understanding for longer than most people can tolerate is not a sign of indecision. It is a sign of intellectual rigor. The person who can tolerate ambiguity long enough to actually understand something complex will produce a better analysis than the person who resolves ambiguity quickly by selecting the first answer that feels sufficient. In practice, this means that the sharpest thinkers often appear to be withholding judgment in situations where others have already declared a conclusion. They ask more questions when others are already convinced. They examine the consensus view more skeptically when others are moving past it. This is not contrarianism. A contrarian disagrees with consensus on principle as a way of positioning themselves. The careful thinker examines consensus precisely because the consensus view is the one that has already been accepted. And the question of whether acceptance was premature is a legitimate and important one. In many group settings, conclusions are reached by social momentum rather than by analysis. The conversation moves in a direction and people go with it, not because they have examined it carefully, but because that is the direction that feels established. The person who notices this, who recognizes that the group is moving toward a conclusion, but because the evidence points there, but because the social dynamics of the conversation have pushed it there, has access to a perspective that the moving group has lost. Acting on that perspective requires some courage. It is easier to go with the social momentum than to apply friction. But the application of genuine analytical friction, the thoughtful question that makes the group slow down and reconsider, is one of the most valuable contributions that can be made in any collective thinking process. It does not need to be confrontational. It does not need to be an announcement that everyone is wrong. It can be a simple, precise question: have we considered this alternative? Is this assumption actually established? What would change if we are wrong about that? Those kinds of questions, asked without ego and without agenda, redirect a group's thinking in ways that are far more productive than most of the things that get said in the average meeting or conversation. And the person who has developed the habit of asking them, who is consistently the one to slow a room down long enough to think more carefully, becomes, over time, the person others want present when important decisions are being made, not because they are the loudest or the most opinionated, but because they are demonstrably the most careful. Being demonstrably careful with your thinking is a form of trust. It tells people that your conclusions can be relied upon, that they are the product of a process that has not skipped important steps. That reliance becomes one of the most durable forms of credibility available, and it is built entirely from the inside out, from an actual commitment to thinking well, not from the management of how thinking is perceived. This is, in some ways, the simplest conclusion of everything discussed here. The behaviors that produce the perception of intelligence, the composed observation, the precise speech, the calibrated confidence, the willingness to acknowledge uncertainty, the restraint in contribution, the quality of questions, are not performances of intelligence. They are the natural, visible outputs of a mind that is genuinely engaged with the work of understanding. You cannot sustainably fake this. The behaviors can be imitated in the short term, but without the underlying commitment to actual thinking, they will not hold up across the range of situations that life presents. They will fracture under pressure, or become inconsistent, or be recognized as performance. But a genuine commitment to thinking well, a real orientation toward accuracy, toward complete understanding rather than quick answers, toward examining your own beliefs as rigorously as you examine anyone else's, produces behaviors that are entirely consistent, entirely natural, and entirely sustainable. Because they are not being produced for effect. They are simply what genuine thinking looks like when it is operating. There is one more dimension of this worth examining before moving toward the final shape of these ideas. It has to do with how knowledge is acquired, not just how it is deployed. The person who wants to be the sharpest thinker in a given environment needs to have something to think with. This seems obvious, but it is often overlooked in discussions of intelligence and communication. Clarity of expression and composure in conversation are genuine advantages, but they operate on the material of knowledge and understanding. A person who thinks clearly but knows little will have less to offer and will be more limited in their analysis than a person who thinks clearly and knows a great deal. This means that intellectual development, in any meaningful sense, requires ongoing input, continued learning, a genuine appetite for encountering ideas and information that expand or refine your existing understanding. But there is a particular kind of learning that is more valuable than the kind that most people pursue. Most people, when they learn, do so within the boundaries of what they already find interesting or relevant. They deepen existing knowledge. They add detail and specificity to frameworks they already have. This kind of learning is valuable. Depth in any area has significant benefits, but it can also reinforce existing limitations because learning that never challenges your existing framework never reveals where that framework is inadequate. The more generative kind of learning happens when you encounter something genuinely outside your existing territory, a domain you have not engaged with seriously, a perspective you have not considered, an approach to a problem that is different from anything in your existing repertoire. This kind of learning is uncomfortable in a specific way. It cannot simply be added to what you already know. It requires you to adjust your framework to accommodate it, sometimes in minor ways, sometimes in significant ones. And the adjustment is the thing that is valuable, because it expands not just what you know, but how you think. The breadth of genuinely engaged learning, not wide reading done superficially, but genuine engagement with ideas from different domains, produces a kind of cross-domain thinking that is rare and genuinely useful. The ability to notice that a problem in one area is structurally similar to a problem in an apparently unrelated area. The ability to apply a tool from one domain to a problem in another. The ability to see that what is treated as a novel challenge in one context has actually been solved in a different context, under a different name. These cross-domain connections are the hallmark of a genuinely well-trained mind. They are not the product of intelligence in a fixed sense. They are the product of having engaged seriously and broadly enough that the patterns beneath surface level differences are visible. And they are, in any group of specialists, one of the most valuable things that can be contributed. Because most specialists are deeply embedded in the particular way that their field approaches problems, they do not see the patterns that someone who has engaged broadly can see. The cross-domain thinker can offer something that the specialist cannot, not because the specialist is less intelligent, but because the specialist has been looking at the problem from inside the framework of their discipline, and the cross-domain thinker can see the outside of that framework. This is why genuinely broad engagement with ideas, maintained throughout a lifetime rather than abandoned after formal education, is one of the most consistent predictors of the kind of thinking that people find valuable. It does not require formal study, it requires curiosity, the simple habit of remaining genuinely interested in how different domains work, in what questions different fields are trying to answer, and what tools they use, is enough to build over time, a kind of structural knowledge that most narrow specialists lack. And curiosity, maintained and applied consistently, produces something that is harder to quantify, but deeply important. A relationship with not. Knowing that is comfortable rather than threatening. The curious person encounters something they do not understand and experiences it as interesting. The person who is defending an existing framework encounters the same thing and experiences it as threatening. These are not fixed personality traits. They are orientations that can be shifted slowly with practice toward or away from genuine curiosity. The shift toward genuine curiosity is one of the most valuable things you can do for your own thinking. It changes the phenomenology of learning from effortful and threatening to genuinely enjoyable. And things that are genuinely enjoyable get done consistently, without the friction of motivation that effortful things require. People who remain genuinely curious throughout their lives keep learning without needing to push themselves. They keep encountering new ideas because they want to, not because they have forced themselves to. And over decades, the compounding effect of that consistent engagement with new ideas is enormous. It produces a mind that is strikingly different from the mind of someone who stopped genuinely learning at 25. None of this is inevitable in either direction. The person who was broadly curious at 20 can narrow and close over time, if they let themselves. The person who was defensive and narrow at 20 can open over time if they work at it. The direction is largely a matter of choice, of whether, in any given moment, you respond to the unfamiliar with curiosity or with defense. Repeated consistently in one direction, those small responses compound into something that defines how you engage with everything. This is the broader context within which all of the more specific skills and habits discussed here live. They are not standalone techniques. They are expressions of an underlying orientation toward accuracy, toward understanding, toward genuine engagement with how things actually are, rather than how you would find it most comfortable for them to be. That orientation, maintained over time, produces a way of moving through conversations and environments that is recognizably different from the way most people move. Not louder, not more assertive, not more aggressive, but more present, more observant, more accurate in its assessments, more trustworthy in its conclusions. And those qualities, compounded over years of consistent practice, produce something that most people would recognize as genuine intellectual authority. Not the kind that comes from a title or a credential, but the kind that comes from demonstrated quality of thinking. That is the kind of authority that no one can take away, because it is not granted by others. It is built from within through the ongoing practice of actually thinking well, and it is available to anyone who is genuinely willing to do the work. The work is not glamorous. It is not dramatic. It is the quiet, daily practice of paying closer attention than most people do, of asking one more question before forming a conclusion, of pausing one extra second before responding in a heated moment, of choosing the more accurate statement over the more comfortable one, of staying open to a new idea even when your instinct is to dismiss it. These are small choices. In any individual instance, they barely seem to matter, but they accumulate, and over time, their accumulation is the difference between a mind that has been continuously refined and a mind that stopped developing at some point and has been coasting ever since. The choice is always in the present moment, not in the past, which cannot be changed, and not in the future, which has not arrived. in the present moment, right now. In this conversation or this decision or this quiet hour of reflection, you are either practicing the orientation that builds clarity or you are not. Neither the choice nor its consequences are dramatic, but the direction they point in, maintained consistently, leads to very different places. Now consider where all of this leads in the actual experience of being in a room, a meeting, a conversation, a group discussion, where the quality of your thinking is visible in real time. The person who has developed the habits described here enters that room differently from the person who has not. Not externally, necessarily. Not with a different posture or expression, necessarily, but internally. They enter with their attention directed outward, rather than inward. They are watching before they are participating. They are registering the dynamics of the room. Who is speaking, who is being listened to, where the tensions are, what the real questions are beneath the stated ones. They are not performing this. They are genuinely interested in what is actually happening because they have developed a habit of genuine interest in how situations actually work. When they do speak, they have already processed what has been said. They have identified what is missing from the conversation, or what the real question is, or what the most precise contribution they can make in this moment would be, and they offer that, concisely, clearly, without padding, and then they stop. They do not need to fill the space after their contribution. They have said what needed to be said. They can return to observation. When challenged, they do not defend by reflex. They actually examine the challenge. They consider whether it is valid. If it is, they acknowledge it. If it is not, they explain clearly and specifically why not. Not with emotion, but with reasoning. They ask questions that are precise enough to redirect the conversation when it needs redirecting, without announcing that they are doing so. They acknowledge what they do not know, specifically and without embarrassment, and they maintain, through all of this, a composure that is not performed. It is simply the natural state of a person who is not at war with the situation they are in, who is not trying to win, not trying to manage perception, not trying to outcompete the other people present, who is simply trying to think clearly and contribute accurately. This is not a heroic picture. It is not dramatic or exceptional in a way that invites admiration. It is simply what careful thinking looks like when it is done well and in public. But the effect of it, over time, on how you are perceived and how you are treated by others is significant. Not because you have engineered it, but because it is the natural consequence of consistent clarity. People trust those who are consistently clear. They seek them out for input when important things are at stake. They take their contributions seriously. That is not a reward to be pursued. It is a natural product of the orientation described here, a byproduct, not a goal. And the fact that it is a byproduct rather than a goal is what makes it real. The person who is genuinely clear is trusted because their clarity is genuine. The person who is trying to appear clear is, eventually, seen through. And so the final point is simply this. The practices described throughout this discussion are not techniques for the performance of intelligence. They are a description of what genuine thinking, consistently applied, actually looks like and produces. The gap between where most people are and where this description points is not a gap of talent. It is a gap of habit and orientation. It can be closed, gradually, through practice, through consistency, through the daily accumulation of small choices in the direction of clarity. The next time you walk into a conversation, a meeting, or a room full of opinions, you will have a choice. You can move immediately into performance, managing perception, competing to speak, defending positions before examining them. Or you can direct your attention outward, observe what is actually happening, think before you respond, speak when you have something precise and accurate to add, and remain composed in the face of whatever the room presents. One of those approaches feels natural and habitual. The other requires the discipline that has been described here. But the discipline, practiced consistently, becomes its own kind of natural. It becomes the default. And when it becomes the default, the person you are in a room, the clarity you carry, the composure you maintain, the quality of your contributions, is no longer something you are trying to produce. It is simply who you are, and that, not the accumulation of credentials, or the volume of your contributions, or the assertiveness of your presence, is what it actually means to be the sharpest mind in any room you enter. Not the loudest, not the most aggressive, not the one who speaks the most or claims to know the most, the one who understands the situation most clearly, the one whose contributions are most reliably accurate, the one whose composure is genuine rather than performed, the one who has built, through consistent practice and genuine commitment, a mind that can be trusted. That is the real thing, and it is available to anyone willing to do the quiet, unglamorous, deeply worthwhile work of building it.